Ngā mihi nui kia koutou. By February of 2020, it had become apparent that COVID-19 would not be contained to China and nearby countries. The world was facing a full-scale global pandemic. Many people's initial response, especially in the West, was to begin stockpiling food and other basic items. Stories began to emerge about heated arguments and fights breaking out in supermarkets, often over the dwindling supplies of toilet paper, despite the fact that there were no actual problems with production or supply. Panic buying began causing shortages. The problems caused by COVID-19 have, of course, extended far beyond consumer stockpiling. As well as its direct impact through illness and loss of life, the secondary effects of the pandemic have been catastrophic. Attempts to restrict the virus's spread through closing borders and lockdowns have devastated national and local economies, and this economic situation has disproportionately impacted women, Black and Indigenous peoples, refugees and asylum seekers, and other vulnerable groups. Many of our politicians have responded in ways that again display a scarcity mentality. To take just one example, in a speech in June, the Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison unveiled his plans to increase Australia's investment in long-range missiles and armaments. And he touted such investment as necessary, quote, to prepare for a post-COVID world that is poorer, more dangerous, and more disorderly. So in light of the virus and its impact, how do we as Christians, theologians, and activists begin formulating a response? How can we talk about God in the context of a scarcity mentality amidst political appeals to the need for rationalising and defending resources? On the 13th of May, 1373, at age 30, the woman later known as Julian of Norwich received a series of 16 dense overlapping visions, centred around the Passion of Christ as the place of God's abundant love. She received her visions while suffering an unknown illness, believing herself to be on a deathbed. Upon recovering, she wrote down her visions and then spent several decades reflecting upon and writing about their significance. And there's striking parallels between Julian's context and our own. First, she had her visions and wrote her theology in a world being remade following a pandemic. The Black Death or bubonic plague had ravaged Europe between 1347 and 51 while she'd still been a child. And estimates are that a third of the population of Norwich had died directly as a result of this plague. Second, Julian's context was also marked by political protest and revolution, notably the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. She received her visions, Amy Laura Hall writes, during a time when peasants, calling for an end to serfdom, burned buildings and even invaded the Tower of London. And third, as with our context, Julian wrote at a time when political leaders were using both plague and rebellion as convenient cover for accumulating and extending power. So the wider period was witnessing an increased centralisation of power into the hands of a small number of monarchies. So there was a rise of authoritarianism of sorts. So this indicates the background of Julian's theology. Even while she makes little direct reference to this wider context, the substance and forms of her writing were subtly contesting many of the assumptions of those holding and exerting power. And this is especially the case, I would suggest, with respect to her central insistence on the sheer abundance of God's love and grace. So Julian's theology witnesses to a God who intimately embraces and lovingly upholds humanity. And it does so abundantly and excessively. And I'll just take one slightly bizarre example. So in one of her more memorable visions of the Passion, she sees copious amounts of blood pouring forth from Christ's wounds after his whipping. And to quote Julian herself, the hot blood ran so abundantly that neither skin nor wound was to be seen, and it was so abundant to my way of seeing that it seemed as if it had been the real thing. It would have saturated the bed with blood and overflowed all around. So in a context where bloodlines were being carefully regulated and the Eucharist highly restricted, Julian has this vision of Christ's blood being endlessly poured out and made available to all. What I want to focus on, however, is a different way in which Julian's theology testifies to abundance. namely through the forms and language of her theology directly. So her dense, complex imagery and language is continually exceeding and disrupting more linear ways of speaking about God and the world. And here I'll just take 3 examples of this. So first, reading Julian as a preacher and performance artist, the womanist theologian Danielle McRae has recently attended to stylistic features of her text. That is the way she uses rhyme, meter, and alliteration. And McRae draws attention to an example where Julian is describing Jesus' death and dying in her 8th vision. So to quote Julian, "And at the beginning, while the flesh was fresh and bleeding, the continual pressure of the thorns made the wounds wide." So Julian deploys her words in a way that's playful and poetic. Second, a certain linguistic excess is apparent in how Julian folds and collapses images and metaphors into one another. She mixes her metaphors. In one reflection, she famously describes Christ as mother, Christ who gives birth to us into joy and endless life. She then proceeds to suggest that as mother, Christ can, quote, lead us intimately into his blessed breast through his sweet open side and reveal within the Godhead and the joys of heaven. So Julian's maternal image, Christ as mother, is then enfolded into Christ's wounds in a way that transgresses gender norms and bodily and linguistic boundaries. And third, Julian deploys explicitly apocalyptic language. The devil, she writes, will be scorned at the last judgment by all those who will be saved, whose consolation the devil greatly envies. All misery and tribulation that the devil would have liked to have brought upon them shall go with him forever into hell. So as with John of Patmos, Julian has visions of a time when the devil and evil will be defeated, when all shall be well, when he shall wipe every tear from their eyes. So what does this mean? So I'd suggest that there's a politics in Julian's abundant, unruly language. And here we might recall Judith Butler's suggestion that regular, common sense language always serves the status quo. To quote Butler, why are some of the most trenchant social criticisms often expressed through difficult and demanding language? So in both Julia's context and our own, utilitarian linear language serves and facilitates the exertion and organisation of power from above. So at least on some level, Julian's very unwillingness to follow the rules of what constitutes good theology or logical thinking is itself a form of resistance and disruption. And I think we could, as Christine's just shown us, we could probably find a parallel of sorts in Matella Althus-Reid's theology. Okay, so to conclude, what can we learn from Julian's excessive, unruly ways of talking about God? How can her abundant language assist us in the midst of COVID-19 and the challenges that we're facing? And in particular, how does it assist us in unraveling and overcoming assumptions of scarcity and appeals to the need for self-preservation by stockpiling and defending resources? So in the context of the present crisis, some of us will no doubt have options for direct kinds of resistance and opposition. So those of us with a relative level of privilege may have options for contesting language of scarcity and rationalisation explicitly, as well as the ways that politicians are mobilising such language. Some of us will have options to hit the streets, and some of us will be in positions to invoke norms of justice, rights and equality to push back against this rhetoric and these troubling developments. For others, such forms of resistance may not be so viable. So for those living under oppressive regimes or in more precarious situations, resistance and protest will likely proceed in ways that are messier and closer to the ground. And this may sometimes involve deploying excessive, abundant language of the kind displayed by Julian. For all of us, I would suggest Julian shows how speaking of an abundant God and speaking abundantly of God can challenge and displace logics of language of scarcity and competition. So she reminds us that we worship a God whose love is continually transgressing boundaries and hierarchies. And Julian's unruly language witnesses to an abundance that scrambles attempt at economic rationalisation and calculation. So in Julian's very last vision, she receives a promise and assurance from God: "You shall not be overcome." These words, she writes, were said very distinctly and very powerfully against the tribulations that may come. And as we too respond in our own context, may we hold in faith that we shall not be overcome. Thank you.